Okay, question for Dr. Williamson.
Hi, thank you for debate. I have a kind of stupid question. What is the, as a point of ETS, what is the cause of universe as a material object?
What is the cause of the universe as a material object?
Who or what did make the universe? Do you have any answer for that one as it is?
Well, I might if I was a physicist, but I'm not. I mean, I think that's the question that I would simply defer to the physicist who's working on cosmology, like Stephen Hawking or somebody like that. No, I mean,
so there is no answer for that one.
Well, part of being an atheist is, to some extent, skepticism about some of the traditional metaphysical questions. So I guess my stance would be that science is responsible for answering that sort of thing.
Actually, science is just, as far as I know, is observation. Something is there, but, you know, that we observe and say that this one was, so we can see that. If I ask this question from Dr. Craig, would say that God, and God is unmaterial, so that, I mean that unmaterial can make this material. But as an ETS, your answer is that I don't have any answer for the cause of universe.
Well, as a philosopher, I don't think I do have an answer. It seems to me, as I pointed out, the scientists who do have the answer. And I think in terms of observation, science being observation, I think you're going to have to include observation of mathematics in that, because it's the mathematics that seems to be what cosmology is based on.
This question gives me an opportunity to respond to the earlier points about the relationship between science and God. I want to again insist that I'm not suggesting that we postulate God as an explanatory scientific entity. That's not the way the argument works. Rather, as you suggested, science drives us back to the moment of creation. And on the standard Big Bang model, this is a singularity at which space and time begin, and all matter and energy come into being. This is the threshold at which science ends. And so I am willing to take hands off as a theist and say, scientists, you do your work. You find out how the universe began. And science drives back to that threshold. But then the philosophical question arises, where did the singularity come from? What brought the material universe into being? And there it seems to me it's entirely appropriate to say there is a metaphysical answer to that question, namely a cause beyond time and space that has brought the universe into being. And then I think you can deduce some of the properties of this cause, and they turn out to be rather theologically significant.
Okay, so we're sort of reaching the end of our time. How are you guys feeling in terms of questions? Keep going?
Fine.
Sure, we can go for a few more minutes.
Okay. All right, I have a question from Thorvaldsen Overflow. This is for Dr. Craig. What are some of the historical data that you cited in favor of a risen Jesus?
Of what?
A risen Jesus.
Okay, wow. You remember I mentioned 3 facts that are agreed upon by most historians who are studied the historical Jesus: the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. What would be some of the underlying evidence that would support those? Well, in my written work, I list something like 8 lines of evidence under various of these points. For example, under the empty tomb, one would be that the empty tomb of Jesus is multiply attested in early independent sources. This is one of the most important criteria of historicity that a historian uses. If an event is attested in multiple independent early sources, then it is less likely that that event was just made up because you have the independent testimony to it. And the empty tomb is attested in something like 5 or 6 very early independent sources. Secondly, the historicity of the burial narrative supports the historicity of the empty tomb. The burial account of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb is widely recognized by historians as belonging to the portrait of the historical Jesus. But if the burial place of Jesus was known in Jerusalem to Jew and Christian alike, then a movement founded on the resurrection of a dead man would have been impossible in Jerusalem in the face of a tomb containing his corpse, so that the tomb must have been empty. by the time the disciples began to proclaim his resurrection from the dead. A third factor that's persuaded a great number of historians is the fact that the empty tomb's discovery is attributed to women. In a patriarchal first century Jewish society, the testimony of women was regarded as worthless. Therefore, if the empty tomb story were a later legendary account, male disciples like Peter and John would have certainly been made to be the discoverers of the empty tomb. The fact that it is women whose testimony is worthless, who are the discoverers of the empty tomb, is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the disciples, or rather the Gospels, record this awkward and embarrassing fact. Am I out of time? What? Yes? Okay, so I'd have to refer you again to the work on my website, reasonablefaith.org, where there's a lot more of this fascinating current study of the historical Jesus relative to this event.
Is it fair game to redirect a question back to Dr. Craig? Okay. Dr. Craig, this is something I've wondered about. I'm not a Bible scholar by a long shot. Are there any other documents besides the Bible that talk about Jesus?
Yeah, actually there are. Jesus of Nazareth is referred to in Roman, Jewish, and extra-biblical Christian sources. Some of these have been cataloged in a book by R.T. France, spelled like the country France, called The Evidence for Jesus, or a more recent book, The Jesus Legend by Paul Eddy and Greg Boyd, has a nice chapter in which they discuss the extra-biblical testimony to Jesus of Nazareth. Josephus, for example, the Jewish historian, has a very interesting passage on Jesus, and even talks about his brother James. He talks about John the Baptist. Many of the same people that appear in the biblical Gospels are there in the pages of Josephus. So it's quite amazing. We actually have more historical information about this relatively obscure man, this Galilean preacher named Jesus of Nazareth, than we do about many major figures of antiquity. So if you're interested, take a look at those books.
Yeah. The reason I bring it up is simply in the course of preparing for this debate, I encountered the claims that there is no record of Jesus apart from
Who said
the
that?
Gospel. I didn't even look at it. It struck me as quite a wild claim.
I will say there are certain kooks out there writing today, especially on the internet, people like G.A. Wells and others who make these radical claims like Jesus of Nazareth never existed and so forth. And they're completely rejected within the guild of professional historians and biblical scholars. And the book by Eddy and Boyd that I mentioned deals extensively with some of these fellows. But as I mentioned, the passage in Josephus, in Tacitus, the Syrian writer Marabar Serapion, there are references in Jewish Talmud. They're discussed in the sources that I gave you.
Thanks. I was rather struck by the claim, and it seemed quite wild to me.